Good afternoon. So I'm here to talk about soil textures. Soil texture triangle, we're all pretty familiar with it. When I'm talking about the soil texture of your field, you're going to be wanting to know how much sand, silt, or clay is in any foot of your soil so that you know what your moisture content can be, how much moisture you could hold. You can find this information on a lot of the soil maps that are out there, but they're not going to be really specific to your individual field. And it is kind of important, especially if areas in your field that are behaving differently than others when it comes to moisture use, that you get out there, get a Dutch auger, dig down, do some hand ribboning, and actually see what you have and what you're working with. You may have sand lenses or a clay spot or something like that, so that when you are watering, they are behaving differently. The easiest way to determine the soil texture of your field or in a specific spot is hand texturing, which I don't know if people are familiar with or not, but I will show you. And I also did bring buckets. If this was a smaller group, I would have invited everybody up right now and we'd go and actually touch it, but it's a pretty big group. Don't think we're going to get through everyone. If you're interested, come over at the coffee break or even at the end of the day. I have the full range of like a really heavy silty clay to a complete sand, and we can go through it. I can show you how to hand texture them. You can just kind of get a feel for it. So you're going to grab a handful of soil. You're going to add moisture to it till it gets about the consistency of, say, like plasticine, Play-Doh, something like that. And you're really just adding moisture or dry soil until you get to that point. You don't want it to be crumbly, but you don't want it to be a muddy mess in your hand either. And you want the moisture evenly throughout. And then once you've reached that point, you just take your thumb and push that soil ribbon up above your forefinger, and it's just gonna keep forming this big ribbon if you have a nice silty loam or silty clay soil. And you know, there are a lot of flow charts and graphs that'll give you numbers and specifics on this, but that's not always something you're going to remember in the field. So I just have this diagram here showing you if you've done this to a portion of soil in your field and you're getting a ribbon that's really strong, it's not falling over, it's not breaking apart in pieces, well then you're going to have a soil that has a pretty high clay content and it's going to be able to hold more moisture. So in about, say, a foot of soil, if it has a high clay content, you're assuming you can hold close to 3 inches of moisture in that soil. If you've done this and you're getting only about that 2.5 inch range, like it's just kind of a mid-range, might be a little weaker, breaks off a little easier, it's going to hold about 2 inches of moisture for that foot. And then the last one is if it's pretty sandy soil, it's not really forming a ribbon. You can maybe make it hold into a ball in your hand. It can do a tiny bit of a ribbon, but it just kind of falls off. It's a sandy soil. And honestly, 8.5 of an inch, maybe an inch if you're lucky sort of thing, is going to have a really low moisture holding capacity. And so we were talking about moisture holding capacity earlier and available moisture, wilting point, field capacity. Break it down really simple. If you guys can see that there's a blue curve and then sort of the brown curve underneath, the blue curves are readily available moisture. That is all the moisture that can be held by a soil at one time, but there's going to be a portion of it, that brown area that's lower, that's your unavailable moisture. It's there in the soil, but it takes too much energy from a plant to be able to access it easily, and so it's not going to be helpful to you. Then for that available moisture, you kind of break it in half, and there's half of it that's slowly available, and then the other half is readily available. And if you can keep your moisture content in that readily available area, it's causing the least amount of stress for your plants to use them. And so that's the real aim when you're irrigation scheduling, is keeping it in that readily available area without overdoing it and now having a soppy mess. So I also brought 3 soils here, and I started with like this gunpowder dry loam soil. It was super dry, broke it into 3 parts, added, 1 bucket has 1/3 of an inch of moisture in it, the next bucket has 1/2 an inch, and then 1 inch. So they're all the same texture, but you could come over and just get a feel for it. That's the hand feel method that we were doing. And so my first bucket that I added, that 1/3 of an inch, it's not very wet. It's pretty dry. You can kind of get it to stick together a bit in your hand, but it's not an amount that's going to be useful to a plant. And so just so that you know what that feels like, that is, I need to add water now. My second bucket, it's kind of halfway in between. So you'd be at the lower end of your available or easily available moisture for your plant, but it's not at a drought point yet for the plant. Like it's getting some things, but you could probably top it up. So it's forming a ball in your hand, but yeah, it's just kind of sticking together. It's not really muddy yet. And then my last one is super saturated and it's kind of a mess. But you can grab it and your hand's gonna get slick and you know that, yes, you are at field capacity, but you don't want to stay there the whole time because you're going to end up having like too low of aeration and you don't want to have root rots, things like that. So try to bounce in between that third bucket and the second bucket, not getting all the way depleted down to that first bucket. It's way too dry. And so I believe it is page 19 of the scheduling guides that are on your table. It has this chart broken down for each different soil texture of if it's a really sandy soil, if it's a loam soil, or if it's a clay soil. And it's just getting you to look at it as in thinking of your soil, that whatever foot you're looking at, as a reservoir and how depleted or how available is it. So when you're grabbing a handful and it still kind of holds a ball, but there's some crumbs happening, that's your 25 to 50% available moisture. And I'm actually just going to go to the next slide because it also means, so that we were looking at a loam soil, that you need to add anywhere from 0.8 to 1.6 inches to get that soil back up to field capacity. Where the second one is a firm ball, we don't really have any crumbs or any mud showing on our hand, and we're at the 50 to 75%. And so you need to add 0.4 to 1.1 inches to get yourself back up to that field capacity. And our last one is starting to leave some staining on your hand, a little muddy. It's at field capacity or just a little bit under, so that 75 to 100% of field capacity. You're gonna add maybe half an inch. And so that's just, it's an opportunity for you to come up and get some hands-on with some soils, feel these different moisture contents. It's a really good practice to be doing out in your own fields. Costs you nothing. You can go out and start monitoring it, and you know whether your plants are going to be heading into a drier time or not. And with that, that's my quick presentation, but I will be around at the coffee break and afterwards if anybody wants to ask questions or take a look at the soils.